The First World War marked for many the first modern industrial war. With it came new technology and new ways of killing on a massive scale. Mines killed thousands in one explosion. The presence of gas seemingly melted lungs and eyes. And machine guns signaled inevitable death for those ordered to charge. For many, the First World War was a terrible nightmare, and that nightmare imprinted itself on the bodies and minds of soldiers in the form of shell shock. Today, we're approaching the 100th anniversary of the First World War, and it seems distant, part of a long ago past. I'm a historian. I really enjoy telling stories about the past. But is there reason to remember the medical mystery of shell shock? Charles S. Myers first coined the term shell shock in this 1915 article in the British journal The Lancet. Myers argued that the impact of an exploding shell could impair the senses. Soon, however, shell shock became an umbrella term for a range of even psychological symptoms. Some soldiers suffered nightmares, others staring eyes. Still others experienced limb dysfunction, violent tremors. At its worst, shell shock completely disabled the soldier. Oftentimes today, we think that this world must have had no answers for soldiers like this. But my research reveals that in fact, one group of US doctors and policymakers believed that they did. They saw that Europe had failed, but these individuals believed that they could succeed and they could cure even this soldier. Where Europe had went wrong, they would do right. The US war effort was extensive, and it began by recruiting the best doctors in the nation. These were individuals that held professorships at places like Columbia, Johns Hopkins, and Harvard. They were founders of journals and leaders of national and international organizations. And these were the individuals that conceptualized the US war effort. They instituted screening, established elaborate hospitals. They developed new machinery to aid in old therapeutic techniques like hydrotherapy, and they instituted occupational therapy on a very massive scale. Now, all of these techniques look very antiquarian to us today. But in fact, as I'm reading what these doctors write, it's become very clear to me that they didn't see it this way. They saw this medical technology as new. They believed they were on the cutting edge of science, and they truly believed that they were going to be able to heal soldiers. They believed it so much so that they oftentimes argued that they would have no post-war readjustment problems with veterans. They only realized how wrong they were in the decade that followed. Suicide rates among veterans skyrocketed. In 1929, when the Great Depression hit, veterans were among the leading groups of individuals that were jobless and homeless. And even by 1930, 1/3 of veterans in VA hospitals, 30,000 individuals, were still suffering from symptoms that had at one time been classified as shell shock. Some individuals at the time attempted to reconceptualize why this had happened. Some argued that perhaps these soldiers who were still suffering had been hereditarily tainted. They had been weak at the outset. Others argued that perhaps these men just didn't want to get better. However, overwhelming evidence suggests that simply policies failed. Today, as we approach the 100th anniversary of the First World War, nearly a century later, is the medical history of shell shock still relevant? War today looks very different than it did in 1914. And certainly, a veteran returning from Iraq or Afghanistan has a very different wartime experience than someone during the First World War. Medicine, too, has changed in dramatic ways. And yet still, war produces trauma. And our medicine still fails to cure it. Today, veteran suicide rates are again rising. We here are only an hour's drive from San Diego, which holds one of the largest homeless populations of veterans in the US, and many argue that this population too is rising. What's most fascinating to me as a historian is to look at the headlines that I read in 1921 and compare them to many of the headlines that we see today. What's perhaps even more striking to me is the fact that oftentimes when we're discussing these issues today, we give them virtually no historical context, when in fact we know that these same issues occur after every war. Perhaps oftentimes we overlook the shortcomings of our own medicine and place the blame on veterans. Oftentimes when I am talking to my research, about my research to someone, one of the first questions they'll ask is, well, you must have veterans in your family. There must be some personal connection that really drew you to this topic. Well, one of my grandfathers is a veteran, and I've learned a lot more about his experience since beginning this project that had nothing to do with me choosing this topic. And it had nothing to do with the conclusions I've reached either. Instead, it was the first time I went to an archive and I checked out a First World War soldier's diary, and I began to read it. Shortly after, I read more. And then I began to read the correspondence of medical doctors, letters that they had sent home from France to their families in the US. And then I began reading medical reports. And then finally, I began reading government statistics. And it was then that I realized what a supreme sacrifice these individuals had given. We oftentimes think about war in terms of physical sacrifices, even death. But here I learned that these individuals had given even their minds. It is only when we develop our history alongside our science and technology that we become aware of the challenges that face us in the future. We cannot expect science and technology to wipe away all the consequences of war. Instead, understanding history should challenge us to anticipate the long-term and lifelong needs of veterans. Thank you.